A man leaves everything he's ever known. His city, his family, his gods, because a voice told him to. He doesn't know where he's going. He's 75 years old, and he's about to walk into the unknown with nothing but livestock, servants, and a promise. This is the journey of Abraham, out of Haran and into Canaan, the opening move of a story the New Testament itself would later point back to as the foundation of Christian faith. Around 1900 BCE, give or take, historians still debate the exact dating of this period, since it comes to us mostly through the biblical text rather than independent records. Abraham is living in Haran, a trading city in Upper Mesopotamia, in what's now southeastern Turkey. It's not a backwater. Haran sits on a major caravan route, a place where merchants and gods and ideas all pass through. According to Genesis, Abraham receives a command: leave your country, your people, your father's household, and go to a land I will show you. No destination named, no map, just go. Think about what that actually meant. This isn't a solo backpacking trip. Abraham takes his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, the people attached to his household, and everything they own on the hoof: flocks, herds, tents. Moving a household like this across hundreds of miles of ancient terrain wasn't a weekend errand. It was closer to relocating a small village, on foot, through territory controlled by kings who owed them nothing. And he's leaving at the age when most men in the ancient world were long past starting over. Centuries later, the writer of Hebrews would single out this exact moment, a man who went out not knowing whither he went, and hold it up as the definition of faith itself. So why would anyone do this? What was waiting on the other end that was worth walking away from everything familiar? The answer starts the moment his caravan crosses into Canaan, and what he finds there is nothing like what he left behind. The journey from Haran to Canaan covers roughly 400 miles. On foot, with flocks and herds and slow-moving carts, that's not a trip you finish in a week. Most scholars estimate it would have taken a caravan like Abraham's several weeks to a few months, depending on the route and how often they stopped to let the animals graze. To put that in perspective, 400 miles is roughly the distance from New York City to Cleveland. Now imagine making that trip without roads, without vehicles, moving at the pace of the slowest sheep in the flock, through land you've never seen, with no guarantee of water at the next stop. The route followed a well-worn corridor, down along the Euphrates, then west and south through Aram and into the highlands of Canaan. Merchants had used pieces of this route for centuries. It wasn't uncharted wilderness, but that didn't make it safe. Genesis names the stops. Abraham passes through Shechem first, then moves toward Bethel, pitching his tent between Bethel and Ai. These aren't invented place names. Shechem and Bethel both correspond to real sites archaeologists have identified in the West Bank region, occupied going back to the Bronze Age. Whether every detail of Abraham's specific visit can be independently verified is a separate question. The archaeological record for individuals from this era is thin almost everywhere in the ancient Near East, but the geography he's said to have walked through was real and inhabited. And that's the complication. Canaan wasn't empty. Abraham is a stranger arriving in someone else's territory, with no army, no legal standing, or no legal claim to a single acre of ground. At each major stop, he builds an altar. At Shechem, at Bethel. For later Christian readers, these altars would carry extra weight. Paul, writing in Romans, points to this exact period of Abraham's life as proof that he was made righteous by faith alone, years before any law existed to keep, and generations before circumcision marked him as the father of a covenant people. Then the story takes a hard turn. Canaan is hit by famine, and Abraham, barely settled, has to decide whether to stay and risk starvation or leave again, this time heading somewhere even more foreign: Egypt. Here's the turning point almost nobody remembers when they think of Abraham's journey to Canaan. He gets there, and almost immediately he has to leave. The famine hitting Canaan isn't a minor dry spell. Genesis calls it severe, the kind of famine that could wipe out a household's flocks and herds within a season. Abraham has just arrived. No stored grain, no local alliances, no fallback. So he makes a call that tells you everything about how precarious this whole venture really was. He takes his entire household south into Egypt. This is the moment the promise gets tested. Egypt at this point is the regional superpower, a centralized, wealthy civilization with a pharaoh at its head, next to a loose collection of Canaanite city-states. Walking into Egypt as a foreign herdsman with a beautiful wife was not a safe move. Abraham knows it. According to Genesis, he tells Sarah to say she's his sister, afraid Egyptians will kill him to take her. It's a startling admission, a man later held up as the model of faith, resorting to deception out of fear for his life. The plan almost backfires catastrophically. Sarah is taken into Pharaoh's household. Plagues strike Pharaoh's house. Pharaoh connects the dots, confronts Abraham, and sends both him and Sarah out of Egypt, wealthier than when they arrived, but with the deception exposed. Here's where scholars still argue. Some read this episode as a doublet, a variant of a story that appears again later in Genesis, with a different king, and again with Abraham's son Isaac. Whether that reflects separate historical incidents or one story remembered differently is genuinely debated. But for Christian readers looking back, the moral tension itself became part of the point. Even Hebrews, which praises Abraham's faith, doesn't pretend he was flawless. His faith is presented as real precisely because it survived his own failures. What's not in dispute is the shape of the journey. Out of Mesopotamia, into Canaan, driven out by famine, down into Egypt, and then pulled back. Because Abraham doesn't stay in Egypt. Enriched, chastened, he turns north again, retracing his steps back to the place between Bethel and Ai where he'd built his altar, back to the land he'd been promised but didn't yet own a single foot of. Abraham comes back to Canaan, roughly where he started, camped between Bethel and Ai, standing at the altar he'd built before the famine ever forced him out. Nothing about his legal claim to the land has changed. He still owns nothing. He's still a foreigner among the Canaanites, but he's back. And that's really the point of the whole episode, at least as later Christian writers read it. The promise didn't collapse the moment things got hard. Abraham left Haran on the strength of a single instruction, got tested almost immediately by famine and fear, faltered in Egypt, and instead of settling permanently where there was food and safety, he returned to the harder, less certain path. What follows in the years after, the birth of Isaac, the covenant, the near sacrifice on Mount Moriah, the eventual purchase of a burial plot at Machpelah, the only piece of Canaan Abraham ever legally owned in his lifetime, all of it builds on this first walk out of Haran. And all of it becomes centuries later the raw material Paul reaches for when he wants to explain what faith actually means. In Romans and Galatians, Paul argues that Abraham was counted righteous not because of anything he did, but because he believed a promise he'd never lived to see completed, making him, in Paul's words, the father of all who believe. That's why this journey still gets told in Christian churches thousands of years later, not as ancient real estate history, but as the first example of a life reordered entirely around trust in something unseen. Remember that man at 75, walking away from everything he knew with no destination in hand? He never actually owned the land he was promised, not 1 acre of it, beyond a burial cave he had to pay for. He just kept walking, kept building altars in ground that wasn't his yet, and kept believing the promise was still standing, even when the famine said otherwise. So the next time someone tells you they're chasing something they can't yet see the end of, maybe ask yourself what Abraham's caravan looked like crossing into a land he'd never lived to fully claim, and what kept him walking anyway.